Thank you. Please sit down. Now, Mr Moss.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. Looking at the issue of a system of fair wages and conditions, CCI contends that in the context of the current environment, a fair system of wages and conditions is one that protects current jobs and provides a good foundation for potential job creation. We note that last year Mr Christmas identified that real increases in minimum wage and above wage price index would improve the attractiveness of high-paid labour relative to low-paid labour. In other words, significant high increases will disadvantage low-paid workers, being the most vulnerable, and in particular those which are most award reliant. And therefore we are concerned that the increase proposed by both the Minister and the USWA, which are well in excess of that figure, may do more to damage the interest of the low-paid than they do to further them. WACOS's cost of living report, I think, is worth noting. Now, whilst we have made comments about concerns about relying too heavily on hypothetical examples, it is a consistent hypothetical example that's been used over the years, and it has, and the data this year shows that for those who are households to which income is significant income is derived from paid employment, their circumstances have improved markedly over the last 2 years. What the report does also show is the marked contrast between the standard of living of those who are in paid employment and those who are reliant on government benefits. It shows, and I think it's well understood amongst all the parties, that the circumstances facing those who are unemployed is a significantly poorer outcome than for those who are in paid employment. And in the current environment, with declining levels of employment, high levels of underemployment, this is a far more concerning issue for those who are in paid employment. We also note that in the current environment, the opportunity for employers to pass on increased costs to consumer is limited. And in those circumstances, then increased costs to employers will ultimately be absorbed through adjustments in labour, hence leaving employees worse off and more vulnerable. In the current environment, there's a much greater focus by both employers and employees on maintaining employment opportunities. And for those employees who have either recently lost their job or who have reduced hours, their focus is on gaining these back. There is not a strong focus in the employment market at the moment for people looking for substantial or real gains in wages. The focus within the labour market is keeping and maintaining employment. So in the context of fairness, we think that this is a far greater consideration than looking at short-term gains in wages. Also in the contracting labour market, it's maintaining the gains that have been achieved over the better years. With the strong economic performance that WA has had, the Commission in Court Session has over successive years granted quite reasonably significant real wage growth to the state minimum wage and award rates of pay. Those benefits are only maintained to the extent that employees are able to maintain their employment. Without a job, those benefits have no value at all. So improving and maintaining living standards is best done in the concept, in the current environment, in maintaining employment. In a submission reply, the Minister has stated that some rates of pay in state awards are only marginally higher than the comparative national award, while others are lower. I've noted that there's been, other than referencing to award-free traineeships and the minimum casual rate, no data has been provided to substantiate this claim. We would note with respect to casual, the casual rates in state awards do vary, and there is a precedent for a number of them around the 25% mark. what we've done is take into account or noting the nature of the state system. We reviewed the rates with respect to shop assistants, kitchen hands and wait persons, so under the shop and warehouse and the restaurateur and catering workers award. And in the case of shop assistants, the gap is $17.10. In the case of kitchen hands,
Sorry, $17.10 in respect of...
so the state award is $17.10 per week higher than the national. Sorry, I should use complete sentences, my apology. And in the case of kitchen hands, as a level 1 grade employee, wait persons as a level 2 grade employee under the restaurateur and catering workers award, the difference is $18.45 higher than the relevant modern award. These are, in our opinion, quite significant gaps or differences in that respect. My concern is that the Minister has put in a comment which is not substantiated by any evidence or any comparators to allow that conclusion to be conclusively drawn in the way it has. For the Commission in Court session in considering improving living standards for employees, we believe it's appropriate for the Commission in Court session to consider the improvements that have been granted through real wage growth increases over the number of years. And in considering it, and considering this particular aspect as part of the 2017 decision, it is really a time for consolidating those increases. And this comes back to the argument we've mentioned before: it's much better to maintain employment than it is to get an increase which is then lost because your hours have been reduced or your employment has become more precarious. So in the current environment, improving the living standards, the focus at this time should be a consolidation of the benefits that have been granted through successive years.
And does that include going backwards to the extent of CPI? If you get no increase and CPI goes up, presumably it's a bit of going backwards.
Yeah, so in this case, yes, in the short term, there is in this year there'd be a going backwards, but when you look at how things have progressed over the years preceding, the net advantage to the low-paid employees is much better. So that's the concept of consolidation. And to the extent that inflation is actually very low at the moment, that probably makes that a more palatable position to be in than if inflation was significantly higher. Though clearly it would be, for that this year, that position would result in a net decline. But
would you say that's still improving living standards?
On the premise that, notwithstanding that net decline, it's assisted in maintaining the existing levels of employment that they have. Because to the extent that, and comment has been made previously with respect to some evidence given a couple of years ago from Professor Barrett, that not all reduction in hours are a bad thing. The comments, our concern is, because the cost of a wage increase to the employer is higher than the net benefit to the employee, then employers will adjust based on the cost to them. So hence, a reduction in hours is likely to result in a net decline.
And is there particular evidence you point to support that?
In our submission in reply, we've given some and relatively rough calculations to show the difference between what the increases that are proposed would mean to employees, taking into account relevant income tax levels.
I'm more going to what you say is the employer's likely response.
Yes, the Fair Work Commission's industry reports for the retail and hospitality industries show quite clearly, and which were commented in last year's Commission Court session decision, or the Wage Case Commission decision, I should say, that there are short-term and long-term responses by employers to increases in wages, and one of those is reduction in hours of working employees, reduction in use of casual staff, an increase in the number of hours that the owners work, and also increased utilisation of salaried staff.
Thank you, Mr Moss.
Mr Moss, can I ask you then, in respect of the issue that Commissioner Emanuel's just asked you about, and the prospect that if no increase were granted, even though inflation is at a low level at the moment, it would, if we were to give no increase, that would constitute a real reduction. How does that fit with Section 50A3's requirement to contribute to improved living standards for employees?
So I suppose the first element is that consideration is one of multiple considerations to be given, so that in of itself doesn't compel...
It's not an overriding.
No. But of course it is a consideration that needs to be given. So in taking that consideration, in improving the living standards of employees, there's two elements there. It's looking at it from the perspective of not only to what extent does this year's decision contribute to improving living standards, but to what extent has the decisions that the Commission has given over the last few years contributed to improving living standards. So it's looking at it from perhaps a longer term perspective.
Well, I'm not sure about that, because if you read Section 50A3, it's talking about each year the Commission is required to consider these things, and the factors to be considered include the need to contribute to improved living standards for employees. So the suggestion might be that we could not, in the state wage case decision, freeze, in effect, the minimum wage in circumstances where the cost of living was increasing, even by a small amount.
And I suppose the first thing I would note is that these provisions are written in very broad terms, so of course there's multiple ways that one could look at how to apply them. Our response would be, yes, that the Commission in Court Session must give consideration to the need to contribute to improved living standard. There's nothing, I think, wrong in that the consideration must be given each year, but there's no limitation as to the Commission looking at what it has done in previous years to influence its thinking about how it needs to consider this criteria in this particular year. And the other aspect there is the concept of to what extent do the increases potentially have a negative impact on employment, and that the living standards of employees are improved markedly by maintaining employment than in not maintaining their current employment levels as well.
All right, thank you for that.
We do note, with respect to protecting those unable to reach industrial agreement, we do have concerns that both the Minister and Unions WA have focused very much on the extent to which the increases in the minimum wages may assist those who already are already covered by an industrial agreement, rather than focusing on those who aren't covered by an industrial agreement. In particular, Unions WA focuses on the flow-on effect of minimum wage increases on bargaining outcomes, which they refer to as the signaling effect. I think that's the wrong argument. The requirement is to consider those who aren't covered by industrial agreements rather than those who are. And we point very much to the low levels of wage price index, in particular for the private sector, and on the assumption that the state wage case decision is predominantly impacting upon private sector wages. We think the private sector wage price index is probably the better consideration to given rather than WPI more generally. given that the public sector wage price index is still sitting above 2%. With respect to equal remuneration, we note that the parties have largely focused on the gender pay gap in their submissions. Notwithstanding the Commission in Court session last year identified that gender pay gap is not a proxy for equal remuneration of work of equal or comparable value. In last year's submission, the Commission in Court session highlighted the role that Principle 10 can play in the issue of equal remuneration, and would reinforce the submissions that we made that the state wage case principles, in particular Principle 10, has shown the level of consideration, or does show a significant level of consideration by the Commission in Court session for this particular criteria. We also note that the findings of the Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre and Workplace Gender Equity Agency reports that's been referenced in both ours and News WA submissions, which have identified that awards have already played a significant role in addressing the gender pay gap, in that they point at the water-reliant roles. The gender pay gap is very low, or in some cases in the opposite direction, and that the gender pay gap increases in roles to which where discretionary wage rates have a higher impact. So I think this reinforces the role that the award system has already played with respect to this particular matter. Turning very briefly to skill development, we are concerned by the arguments of both Ministry and Unions WA that we need to significantly increase apprenticeship and traineeship rates to encourage young people to take up these opportunities. It does largely ignore that the decline in apprenticeship and traineeship numbers is arising out of the decline in demand of the positions, not in the supply of applicants. I think the best way to express that is in 2012, in WA we had 34,100 apprentices and trainees in Western Australia. And this was at a time when both wage growth and demand for labour was high. And in that environment, it was actually far easier for potential applicants to be enticed away from doing an apprenticeship or a traineeship to take up work in lower skilled, say predominantly labouring positions, which at the time attracted high rates of pay. And yet, even at that point, we had far more apprentices than what we currently do. To suggest that young people who are facing a 14.7% unemployment rate aren't attracted to the opportunities that apprenticeships and traineeships provide for both improved employment security, both during the duration of their apprenticeship and thereafter, and the higher wage outcomes, makes, in our opinion, very little sense. By way of conclusion, we'd say that now is not the time for significant growth in wages. It's a time for a conservative approach to wage policy. In recent times, we've been fortunate to have had high levels of employment that allowed WA workforce to expand and develop the valuable skills that will continue to be needed as the WA economy transitions from the boom. One of the things we are concerned about is that the capability built up within WA workforce may well diminish as people leave the state for improved employment opportunities over in the East Coast. Or alternatively, as Mr. Christmas identified, taking themselves out of the labour market if opportunities aren't maintained. We believe this will also ultimately have an impact on future growth within the economy. Consequently, a wage policy that gives greater consideration to protecting employment, we believe will not only advantage to the advantage of employees, but also the employers as well. And we can believe that this can be best achieved by maintaining the current wage rates and thus reducing the pressure on employment and employment growth. We would also just reinforce that we think that there is a need to focus on the state of the economy as it is now and what is happening in the labour market now. We look forward to opportunities for the economy to grow and for the labour market to improve. But we're not there yet, and we don't think that it's appropriate to be focusing on wage increases as to what might occur. In a couple of years' time, we need to be focusing on ensuring that we give the best opportunity for that to occur. And just finally, with respect to the proposed amendments to the traineeship list that the Minister has provided, we have since had an opportunity to review that list, and we have no objections to that revised list. May it please the Commission.
Mr. Moss. All right, I've got a quick question for you. In your submission in reply, I think at paragraph 319, you refer to Unions WA, as you say, making an assumption that low-income earners will spend a pay rise that they receive, and you say that they ignore the propensity for employees to effectively save that money.
Yep.
Do you say minimum wage employees will save the increase?
There's a couple of things. There is both the concept of minimum wage employees saving, but also paying down debt as well. So one of the part of the issue, sorry, and I'll just grab that.
Well, maybe I'll rephrase my question then. Is your suggestion that minimum wage employees will use it to pay down debt?
Yeah, so the capacity to save is probably more diminished than it is with higher paid employees, but that's not to say that there's no capacity to save. But we would note that their capacity to save is significantly less. But there is opportunity to. One of the ways that you can increase your financial position, though, is to pay down debt. So that might be paying down mortgages, car loans, those types of things.
All right, and I think you answered my question. You're saying minimum wage earners would do that.
Yeah. So that's another. So one can't necessarily assume that more money in means more money out. As I mentioned before, there are some leakages in that, with things like income tax and the like. But things like paying down debt is one of those too.
Thank you, Mr. Moss.
Just one question, Mr. Moss. Following your comments about Section 58.3, if the Commission and Court session were to conclude that it's not open to effectively freeze the minimum wage in light of the statutory criteria, can we read into your written submissions a fallback position? That is the submission you make to the National Wage Review? Yeah,
so the submission, so we haven't formulated a fallback position, and I probably wouldn't state one until we see the federal decision, at any rate, to the extent we do formulate one. With respect to our position in the national wage case, the position that we've taken, which is aligned with the position of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and also the other state chambers, is for effectively an $8.10 increase, which is at 1.2%. So that will sit marginally above inflation on the premise that, and that's taking into consideration that the national minimum wage is lower than the state minimum wage, and to a certain extent has been contained by what's been happening in the East Coast. So it is more appropriate with the national minimum wage for us to be taking a position based on what's happening at the national level, rather than simply focusing on the state level. But to the extent that the Commission has the viewpoint that it must give an increase of some measure, irrespective of what that might happen to be, then our clear and consistent message is that should be conservative and really shouldn't be focused on looking towards real wage gains at this point in time, but should be more heavily focused on minimising any negative impact that an increasing will have on employment. And if you're looking at core messaging, that's what I would suggest it is.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Moss.
Thank you.
Dr. Diamond.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. May it please the Commission in court sessions. Unions WA relies on its initial submissions and submissions in reply to make its main points regarding our claim for $45 per week increase at levels C14 to C10 and a 5.7% increase to levels thereafter. However, we would seek to expand on some key points. Unions WA is contending that the Commission should make a substantial real wage increase for award-reliant workers. We've argued for some years now that these workers have not been getting their fair share of WA's economic growth, and this has been demonstrated by measures of economic inequality, such as the gender pay gap, the disparity between the minimum wage and average weekly earnings, so the minimum wage bite, and also some measures of household income inequality. Unions WA has also noted the host of commentators and institutions pointing out that low wage growth is a big threat, one of the biggest facing the Australian economy as a whole. The wage price index most recently has shown that WA recorded the lowest throughout the year wage growth of about 1.2% to March 2007. That's the lowest out of the states. So therefore, Unions WA is advocating the increase that we are, $45 a week at levels below C10 and a 5.7% increase thereafter. Basically to seek to address all of those points of inequality, and to also make a contribution to the recovery of the WA economy, and by extension, we would hope, have a positive effect on the national economy. Now, in a sense, our claim is similar to the ACTU's in that we certainly share the ACTU's concern about the decline in the minimum wage bite. However, I direct the Commission to our initial submission, specifically to paragraph 6.2, where we have a chart that actually sets out the minimum wage bites of WA compared to Australia. And we simply make the point, as we have in previous years, that the fall in the minimum wage bite in WA for about around 49% to just over 40% is more dramatic than it has been at the national level. So, in a sense, our argument is that $45 a week is actually more restrained in the WA context, simply because this would very much be should the Commission agree to award that increase, that would be more in the way of sort of trying to hold the line rather than making a substantial redress at this point. We would also sort of, on the point about whether the minimum wage would be going backwards in real terms if the Commission decided to go with the Chamber of Commerce's claim. Well, if we're in the world of going backwards, there's also an argument in that case for trying to go backwards to an earlier point of the minimum wage bite as well, when we had a much higher proportion of the minimum wage to average weekly earnings. So, but we are firmly of the belief, or Unions WA is firmly of the belief, that the WA Industrial Relations Commission should not preside over minimum wage adjustments that result in either falling or merely treading water minimum wage bites. Just as the Commission has led with maintaining a higher state than a national minimum wage that has taken account of, among other things, historically higher living costs in WA, so too it should take the lead in reversing the erosion of relative living standards for the low paid, and in doing so fulfil its statutory requirements, among other things, of maintaining a fair system of wages and conditions. And in terms of other considerations in the Act, it also has the opportunity to take the lead in addressing and arresting the decline, or at least the tepid, aggregate demand in the WA economy. and arresting the drag on growth that income inequality has been causing not only the state but also nationally as well. So turning to the submissions from the other parties, the submission by the Minister for Commerce. The Minister for Commerce has submitted that a claim for $19.20 per week adjustment that would increase the state minimum wage by approximately 2.8% at the lower level. Now, Unions WA welcomes the Minister's submission that the state minimum wage should be increased by more than the estimated CPI inflation rates as forecast by WA Treasury. We particularly go on to look at the Minister's paragraph 20 that says that the Minister's proposed increase to this year's state wage case may assist with household consumption, given low-income earners spend a larger proportion of their disposable income and have a lower capacity to save. However, we'd seek to make 2 points with that. As with the federal budget, which commentators have made much of, there's still an issue of where the future wage growth will come from in terms of the forecast of wage growth that have been made. Also, the Minister's proposed increase in the state minimum wage is, in our view, still too conservative, given the persistence of measures of inequality in WA, such as the gender pay gap. So Unions WA would submit that. While it remains the case, Unions WA would also submit that, given that WA retains a state award system with the various awards classifications, the WA Commission does have a responsibility to address and ensure that award classifications, C14 to C10, C10 and thereafter, are meaningful. That there is still that margin for skill at the same time as addressing the needs of the low paid. So given our claim is for, once again, a flat amount at the lowest levels and a percentage proportion at the levels above C10, we feel that our claim would both focus the larger benefit to the lower paid, but at the same time would retain some of the relativities within the award system. So the WA government claim, while it certainly concedes the need for an above inflation increase and certainly attests to the role of the minimum wage in increasing household consumption. However, the relative modesty of the claim would, in our view, not meet the requirements of the Act. It would not meet the needs of the low paid, and it would not ensure that Western Australians have a fair system of wages and conditions of employment. So while we welcome some aspects of the Minister's claim, we obviously feel that it needs to be stronger than what the Minister has so far submitted. Turning to the submission by the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce and Industry has submitted that the interests of employees on state awards are best served by consolidating past gains in the minimum wage by maintaining award rates and the state minimum wage at their current level. And it is our view that the Chamber of Commerce claim, should it be awarded, would not meet the needs of the low paid or contribute to improved living standards. And insofar as the Chamber has called attention to the government's public sector pay policy, really the Commission should place no weight on that in its deliberations. Insofar as the structure of that particular policy has any relevance, it's simply worth noting that the thrust of the policy provides for larger increases at the lower paid end of the public sector pay scales than at the higher paid end. And this is simply demonstrating, insofar as there's a larger effect from a $19.20 at the lower end, that is simply an attesting to the fact that people obviously at the lower end of the award pay scales are lower paid. And that goes to the other points that have been made, which is the larger propensity, if you like, for people on lower paid levels to spend money, consume, call it what you will. So the Commission has recognised in previous decisions that a zero increase to the minimum wage does not meet the considerations of the Act. It doesn't provide for fair standards. It certainly wouldn't provide equal remuneration for men and women for work of equal and comparable value, and would not meet the needs of the low paid. We would argue that the WA Treasury, insofar as the Commission, the Chamber of Commerce, I should say, has been drawing attention to the performance of the WA economy. We draw the Commissioner's attention to the WA Treasury's Outlook document on its page 7. That basically says that household consumption expanded by a modest 1.6% in 2016. So it lifted slightly from a growth of 1.3% in 2015. Growth in 2016 was underpinned by non-discretionary and quote-unquote other spending, which contributed 1.5 and 0.2 percentage points to growth respectively. Discretionary spending contracted in 2016, subtracting, I should say, 0.1 percentage points from growth. The outlook goes on to say, modest growth in household consumption, particularly discretionary spending, is consistent with weak labour market conditions, record low wage growth, and subdued population growth. Notwithstanding this, growth in household consumption is expected to lift from 1.75% in 2016-17 to 3% in 2019-20 as labour market conditions improve. Now, I guess Unions WA would pose the point here, where is this growth going to come from? It would seem to us that it has to come from an increase in wages. Certainly, both at the state and the national level, wages are forecast to increase. But they don't increase, at least not. They won't increase essentially unless existing wages are maintained and built upon, unless institutions such as Fair Work Commission, institutions such as the WA Industrial Relations Commission, actually make the decision to increase wages.
So, Mr. Diamond, you would take the opposite view to the process that Mr. Moss described of having investment first and economic development. You say that wages can be a driver.
Yes, we would be saying that wages can definitely be a driver. And indeed, the question of where aggregate demand comes from is something I'm going to address a little later in my presentation.
Against the background of that, Doctor, you don't express in terms of your case and the host of commentary about low wage growth. Are you in disappointment about government wages policy?
Are we disappointed about government wages policy?
Well, in terms of Mr. Moss making something of that, you said we ought to ignore it.
Yes. We don't think that we don't think that the weight that is being placed by Mr. Moss on government wages policy as some sort of demonstration that the government doesn't seriously believe its own case for a minimum wage increase, we don't think that should be given any weight. The government has decided, and I'm trying to make the government's case here, we can address this more clearly later on. The government's case is about an increase at the lowest level. We think we welcome their case insofar as it demonstrates that a minimum wage increase is needed above inflation, or at least above forecast inflation. We don't think it's enough. But in terms of should there be if the government has this particular pay policy for its own staff, therefore you shouldn't give the increase to the minimum wage, well, we don't think that's a valid argument.
Right, you attack the logic of what Mr. Moss is saying.
I attack the logic of what he's saying.
I understand.
I guess going on from that point, at various points in its submission, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, after certainly after criticising the idea of a arbitrary increase, that was their word for the minimum wage, nevertheless goes on to praise essentially arbitrary cuts to wages, specifically by its citing the Griffin Coal termination decision and also the Fair Work decision penalty rate cut. Well, those, in our view, are clear cases of examples of money disappearing from the economy. That's unilateral wage cuts, achieved not through any kind of negotiation, but achieved through arbitrary decisions that have essentially outlined maximum damage on certainly the community of Collie, to take an example from that, and would certainly damage the pay packets of low-wage workers across the country, including in Western Australia. Far from addressing the need for more wage growth, that would actually be cutting wages. Those would be wages, money destroyed in the economy. One of the reasons we have agreements that set out wage rates that go for a number of years is to try and ensure that there's a certain amount of stability of wages within the economy. The issue is raised, what about the here and now? Well, if everybody cut wages just for the here and now, then that would be pro-cyclical in terms of it would increasingly drive the economy into a bog. The whole point of maintaining wage rates is to maintain a certain level of demand in the economy in order to maintain a certain amount of stability. But in terms of using the Griffin Coal termination decision and the Fair Work Commission penalty rate cut, those are examples of money disappearing to the economy. Those have had and will have a detrimental effect on workers. Those developments are threats to the wage growth that both WA and the economies definitely need. So in that sense, the Commission should certainly place no weight on those. And indeed, insofar as the Commission maintains its position that there should be no increase in the minimum wage whatsoever, we don't think it's really in compliance with virtually any part of the relevant Section 50A3, and not even the areas that the Chamber of Commerce claims as its own, which is issues around those clauses around what's good for business, because as we'll go on to say, we don't think it actually checks out on that level either. Now, turning briefly to the submission by the WA Council of Social Services, we're supportive of the WACOS claim, an increase in the minimum wage rate and the minimum award rates, $45 a week up to the C10 level and 5.7% beyond that. I won't want to anticipate WACOS's presentation, but I'll just point out, as we did in our reply submission, that their information contained in their submissions contains evidence that the labour market and the need to have an increase in the minimum wage is not simply about relative deprivation, if I could put it like that, of low-wage workers. But it also points out, when you take into account things like costs of transport, is one of the things that we took from their submission, and we made a point, that points to the rigged and unbalanced nature of the labour market itself, which is the reason why minimum wage system and certainly regular minimum wage increases are important at all, and why they should occur. Turning to the submission of the Printing Industries Association of Australia, the Printing Industries Association has argued that the Commission should show extreme restraint in its consideration of the WA state minimum wage. Once again, Unions WA would contend that the wage growth figures, both in WA and Australia broadly, shows that the association has really already had its wish in terms of low wage growth. Given the low wage growth nationally, the low wage growth in WA, we're already operating under a situation of extreme restraint. But the results, as outlined in the recent federal budget, is that economic growth across the board has been tepid. Turning briefly to the submission of Connie Tawney. Unions WA is supportive of Ms Tawney's concerns regarding her short shifts and travel costs in the in the community services and homes care sector. Now, the Chamber of Commerce seeks to have her considerations dismissed on the grounds that she are not about wages as such, and she may be a National System Award employee. Well, frankly, as we've heard from the Minister, amongst others, over the years, it's difficult enough for specialists in this area to work out the beginnings and ends of the state and federal system. Certainly, we can only make very broad estimates, going between 20% and 32% and thereabouts. So, given that we have difficulty, members of the public will probably find it more difficult still. But regardless of whether she's in the state or national system, her situation does provide an illustration of the frictions that are present in real labour markets. Travel costs, travel time, shift arrangements, these are real issues that are not captured by sort of matching things to pure measures such as the Consumer Price Index and things like that. So moving on to expand on a couple of points that we made. We put in an extensive section in our initial submission on estimating the demand impacts of our claim. Unions WA is arguing that an increase in the WA minimum wage and award minimum wages will raise household spending and demand for goods and services in the WA economy. An increase in sales revenue is likely to have an increase in employment and profits. Now, people have raised questions about to what extent that impact will be substantial or not. Goes back to that general point about exactly how many people will be impacted by a minimum wage system. But put it this way, look, it could be twice our estimate, it could be half our estimate, it could be a third of our estimate. The point is, though, that there is a stimulatory impact. And insofar as the decisions that are made by this Commission do have an impact out there in the real labour market, the fact that there's a stimulatory effect, particularly in a low wage growth environment, is definitely something that should be taken into account. Now, the intellectual pedigree, if I could put it, of our approach of trying to measure the stimulatory effect of a wage increase is fairly well established. John Maynard Keynes, during the work during the Depression, in his classic The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, 1936, is essentially an attempt to provide an answer to the question how unemployment could be reduced. Now, it's a simple idea in essence. The argument is that increases in spending result in increases in aggregate spending, output, income and employment that are greater than the initial amount of spending. And that's what we mean by the multiplier effect. It's right there in the name. An increase in the minimum wages and awards would lead to an increase in the net incomes of low-paid workers. Now, there is extensive empirical evidence, both domestically and internationally, that the marginal propensity to consume out of income is higher for lower income households than higher income households. At low levels, an increase in income is likely to see a higher marginal propensity to consume, that is, the proportion of extra income that is spent. This is because people on low incomes have many goods and services they need to buy. However, at higher income levels, people tend to have a greater preference to save because they have most of those goods already. So the higher the propensity to consume at the lower the level of the initial income state, then the greater is the multiplier effect. Now, the Treasury multipliers that Unions WA and the ACTU used to estimate the impact of a minimum wage increase assumed that an increase in income was achieved across an income spectrum. So that could include higher income households with much higher savings rates and are not so sensitive to the greater propensity to consume as those with lower incomes. So in that sense, we think that our the Treasury estimates that we used, these were taken from the 2008-2009 Federal Treasury documents, are conservative. Once again, we're making a quite conservative claim for the impact of the multiplier in terms of an increase to the state minimum wage. The multiplier effect comes about because of injections of new demands for goods and services to stimulate further rounds of spending. It's captured in the old phrase, and one person's spending is another person's income. And this leads to a bigger eventual financial effect on output and employment than the initial injection. Okay. So hence the effect of an injection of new demand for goods and services, i.e. from an increase in the minimum wage, will have positive demand consequences within the economy.
Is one factor that we need to have regard, Dr. Diamond, in that demand-driven approach is the reaction of the firm, the reaction of an individual business to, for example, a very significant increase, let's say, in the minimum wage. I think Professor Barrett might have touched on this in her evidence a couple of years ago. As I recollected, it was that, particularly in small firms, it may lead to either an increase in work the proprietor performs, a reduction in hours, or reduction in shifts, or in the worst case scenario, I suppose, loss of employment. Is there any factoring in of the reaction of firms in that demand-driven analysis at all?
There is. So essentially, the lower the income of the household, let's put it like this. Sorry, I'll start from. The proposal that we have starts from a household. So the lower the income of the household, the more they will spend on additional income they have received. So what we're factoring in is the extra amount that they will be spending on goods and services themselves that sort of moves throughout the economy. That is creating extra sales revenues for business. Businesses, accordingly, can react by, they don't necessarily need to cut staff, they don't need to retrain hours, they can in fact respond by putting in extra orders requiring extra hours of work and yielding additional profits. So the extra hours worked yield the workers extra income, about a proportion of which is spent on goods and services again. So as the process continues, the total increase in expenditure, income and employment resulting is higher, arguably much higher, than the initial increase themselves. And that effect happens regardless of where the initial increase in expenditure comes from. So some of the arguments here are about sort of the original, for example, the Rudd stimulus package back in 2009 was something that was coming from the government. However, we would argue that an increase to the minimum wage is actually a longer term and more sustainable kind of stimulus, precisely because once the multiplier process is underway, extra sales, revenue, profits, employment, income and expenditure can basically come from any number of places. So on the one hand, it's not always easy to evaluate the effects empirically on a specific change in income or expenditure, but it can take place to a point where, I'll just move it along here. But if it takes place when there's underutilised resources in the economy, because that's what we're finding here, there's an aggregate effect that will happen in real time. So the more people spend of an extra income they receive, the increase in the minimum wage would be much more effective as a stimulus than simply sort of handing, if you like, government money. So in terms of how it works for business, business benefits from the improved aggregate demand environment. And so simply making the statement that some people may lose hours, some things may be adjusted and all those sorts of things. Once the economy itself has the demand in it, then those adjustments can eventually sort of settle on, if you like, a higher level of economic activity that benefits the business rather than a lower level.
So the approach is the aggregate impact will outweigh any immediate short-term impact, is really what you're saying, if I'm understanding your argument. Thank you.
Yes.
But the aggregate effect of any decision we make is going to be tiny in light of a government wages policy where the biggest employer in the state is clearly going to make serious attempts to rein in real wage growth. I mean, if you were seriously talking about an effect on the economy and getting a multiplier of everything we could do, a multiplier effect of everything we could do, the increase would have to be extraordinary to overcome what the government's offering.
Well, that would assume that the government necessarily sees their pay policy as necessarily an austerity measure.
Well, they've got their reasons for doing it, but the effect will be that wage growth won't be big. Let us say that it plays out in the way that the government intends, that wage growth won't be big. Anything we could do to have an effect on the economy, and this is quite apart from any argument you might want to make about living standards and so on, but if we're going to stray into the effect that our decision could have on the economy, it must be in terms of multiplier negligible, surely.
Well, it's true enough that the effect of the minimum wage increase that comes out of this tribunal will be small compared to other points in the economy. But we don't necessarily assume it will be negligible. There are different estimates that we do replicate in our initial submission about how the multiplier is going to work. There are lower estimates, there are higher estimates. We also make some fairly conservative estimates about what constitutes if you like, average earnings for people on awards. We choose some national figures rather than WA figures, so once again we're being conservative about that as well. Also, and I'm jumping ahead a bit here, but the sort of issue that's been raised by Mr. Moss, and also looking at a discussion that happened last year as well about the signalling effect. Well, once again, other people at the lower end, at the award-free end of the labour market. So we're not talking about people who are on the agreements, we're actually talking about people who are on that award-free sort of area. Issues around sort of what's a fair thing, what's a fair amount to be paid. Those sorts of people in that part of the labour market do pay attention to the minimum wage, and so you are sending a signal about what's a fair minimum, about what's a fair standard, what's a fair thing in the labour market to be paid, that can have a ongoing effect that's larger than a sort of a pure, narrow interpretation of exactly how many people this particular wage decision will impact.
Okay, so that's the signalling over, and I suppose I might just verbalise now that I'd be interested when it's Mr. Toomey's turn on his views on signalling and how it means, if it works in the way you suggest, the minimum income earner never catches up, or sorry, never makes any real inroads comparatively into what other people are being paid, because their pay increase just is a signal for pay increases up the tree. That's not a question for you, I'm just signalling it.
Okay, so our argument coming down, so I'll try and sum this up. Basically, to the extent that an increase in demand contributes to inflation, then any multiplier for real goods and services will naturally be smaller. To the extent of any initial increase in expenditure, for instance, government expenditure, that gives rise to borrowing and might yield higher interest rates, so the multiplier would be lower. So those are alternative ways of looking at the multiplier. But an increase to minimum wages and awards is an increase in income to households, and in that sense would be a much more effective stimulus package if it was applied. Obviously it's more stimulatory the more people who it's impacted. We do have those issues about exactly how many people would be impacted, but nevertheless it's a more effective and, if you like, sustainable stimulus than perhaps a sort of a one-off payment, which was the famous Rudd government stimulus package and the way that worked. So, moving along, we also included in our initial submission a statement around the broad impact of minimum wages on employment, and Unions WA included an argument in that the labour market in practice has always diverged from the expectations of conventional economic theory. And we started that by using the example of Lucy Ellis, Assistant Governor of the Reserve Bank, talking about the impact of or more to the point, the lack of an impact of an increase in female wages, which should have, according to conventional economic theory, resulted in more female unemployment, coincided with a very large increase in female employment. Now, many of the assumptions behind submissions to these hearings are based on premises of perfectly competitive labour markets in which buyers and sellers always find one another. Whereas we are arguing, and we said this in our thesis, that other theories of the labour market, particularly the idea of the monopsony labour market, are much more in accord with reality of how labour markets work. So a monopsony, if you like, is a monopsony of a buyer rather than a seller of labour. Now, a monopsony employer, if they want to hire an extra worker, they need to pay a somewhat higher wage. That's because as wages rise, other workers will enter an industry dominated by a single employer that will be attracted by the incentive of higher rewards. So what would happen is that an employer would have an existing set of workers. If they need to hire more workers, in which case they to increase output, deal with more customers, all of those sorts of things, they would need to hire one extra worker. However, they would need to hire one extra worker at a higher price than their existing workers. And this would act as a disincentive to hire that extra staff. So that's the marginal cost of employing an extra bit of labour. So in that sort of environment, without a minimum wage, the monopsony employer operates with vacancies. They're unwilling to raise the wage they offer to hire additional workers because they would have to pay the higher wage to existing workers as well. However, with a binding minimum wage, that is a minimum wage above the rate the monopsonist is already paying, the employer can fill their vacancies without having to worry about increasing everybody else's wages, because that's already required by the minimum wage. Now, these sorts of labour markets are far more common than the idealised, perfectly competitive markets, even in situations when there are very many independent employers. A monopsonist employer has discretion over pay because of what are called labour market frictions. And these frictions exist when employees face high costs from, say, changing jobs, from needing to travel long distances to take up employment, those sorts of situations. And indeed, if you look at the more likely precarious nature of employment in industries covered by the state minimum wage, or what we describe in our initial submission, in its who is likely to be impacted by the minimum wage, so that's the section 4. We seek to update it every year, so it's not a new piece of information by any means. You'll see that those sorts of vulnerable workers are far more likely to be on the state minimum wage, therefore are far more likely to be, if you like, face less choice about their employers, more likely to be locked in, more likely to be vulnerable. But that also means that a minimum wage increase in this sort of labour market will have at worst no effect on employment, and given the low wage growth dragging down the economy, is far more likely to be stimulative. Now, once again, each year we do round on the argument about exactly what the employment effect is of the minimum wage. We do cite in our initial submission a summary of the recent literature on minimum wage economics, which found essentially no effect of minimum wage increases on employment. While some companies may respond to a minimum wage by reducing employment, it's certainly true, this will be offset by others who would increase it. That's what the studies and the literature have found it, and that's what to be expected if firms have a monopsony, a single buyer-like power. So Unions WA insofar as Unions WA contends that employers cannot credibly argue, given the low levels of wage growth, that they are currently operating in a high-cost labour environment. If anything, their positions in the labour market have provided them with substantial powers to hold costs down, as is demonstrated by the low levels of wage growth that we're currently experiencing. Now, the federal government, once again in the budgets, has clearly indicated that to the labour market that wages must rise in order to secure future economic growth. But Australia has institutional mechanisms by which wage growth has been traditionally secured. These include minimum wage decisions. So the point that Unions WA is making that with limited options in a labour market that operates as a monopsony, hemmed in by labour market frictions such as higher transport costs for workers, and in an economy being held back by low wage growth, a substantial increase in the state minimum wage is needed. And with that in mind, the mention has been made earlier on in the day about levels of youth unemployment. So the youth unemployment figures, it will be interesting to see the latest figures, but historically one of the bigger areas or regions for high youth unemployment has been the Southwest Metropolitan Region, an SA2 in statistical parlance. Those are areas that include things like areas like the Kwinana Strip. During the last period of the last state government, those areas ended up missing out on a substantial amount of business coming out of the resources boom. The Australian Steel Institute certainly emphasised that a lot of the metal fabrication shops, a lot of local manufacturers missed out on work associated with the resources boom. A lot of those places would conceivably have taken on more apprenticeships, would certainly have provided opportunities for skilled employment. And some of the results have been that those areas you get concentrated amounts of youth unemployment. And the fact that they're concentrated demonstrates that, once again, there are a certain number of opportunities for certain workers, particularly at the low wage scale, are very limited. It's difficult to move geographically with quite as easily. It's certainly more easy for some people to move than others. And as a result, wage growth where it comes from institutional decisions. So to conclude, Unions WA is advocating that the Commission increase award wages by $45 a week for levels C14 to C10 and a 5.7% increase at the higher levels. The state minimum wage increase should be greater or higher than the all-group CPI increases for Perth, because costs that fall disproportionately on low-income and award-reliant workers have increased at a faster level than the minimum wage over a number of years. Just to pick out a few points on the question of can you protect employees who are unable to reach an industrial agreement, I just refer you to our paragraph 8.2 in our initial submission. Oh, sorry, not 8.2, 8.12. Where we do make the point that that the Commission should place no weight on claims that a minimum wage increase will discourage bargaining, and that it's more probable that a minimum wage increase will act as a spur to bargaining, particularly on those award-free areas, and those areas that are not, and we would add, areas that are not covered by an agreement. In terms of encouraging skills development, Unions WA contends that apprenticeship and training wages in the state system should have a substantial increase in order to encourage increased participation. The talk of from people from the other parties about what about the here and now. Well, for young people undertaking an apprenticeship or traineeship, what about the here and now means how can I afford to be on this apprenticeship? How can I afford to be undertaking training? How can I meet the recent course fee increases? It's been frozen now, but it hasn't been for the past few years. These are the things that actually determine where somebody can actually stay in training for a substantial period of time. In terms of equal remuneration for men and women for work of equal or comparable value, it is certainly true that the wage gap, if you like, for award workers, or the gender pay gap, I should say, for award workers is smaller than the average amount overall. So I think nationally it's something like 13.5%. That's precisely an argument for increasing the minimum wage and for increasing the award rates, because it demonstrates the importance of the award system in acting to actually close that gap. So, and finally we conclude that Unions WA points out that the WA Commission has been warned year after year about the potentially dangerous effects of unemployment, of raising the state minimum wage by too much. Once again, we would argue that these are based on sort of economic theories that don't really reflect the reality of how labour markets work here in Western Australia, or certainly anywhere. And to that end, given the other considerations in the Act, looking at sort of the needs of the economy as a whole, as well as some of those issues around sort of the needs of the low paid and the sort of fair system of wages and of pay and conditions, etc., the Commission should not refuse to increase the minimum wage. It should certainly increase the minimum wage by above inflation. And it should deliver a substantial increase to the minimum wage that redresses those inequalities and gives a substantial boost to spending in the economy. And that broadly encompasses the Unions WA position today. I'll just take a small aside to note that with the skills list that was provided by the Minister, Unions WA has no issues with it as it stands.
I just have one question before others, if I may, Doctor. You said that CPI increases fall disproportionately upon low-income workers, and that CPI has increased at a faster rate or at a greater rate than the minimum wage. Is that... I know from discussion last year that we work with projected CPI. Mm-hmm. Is that what you're talking about?
What I'm saying is that it ought to increase because the all-group CPI figure, that's the one that's quoted in the media, the classic one, etc., that does not reflect the costs, certain costs that fall disproportionately on low-income earners. So that's the point we're trying to make.
Right. Okay. But you're not saying that. If you just take the headline CPI, that the minimum wage hasn't kept pace with CPI over the years. You're saying that if you extract some goods from the basket, the ones that you say ought to be extracted for low-income workers, then...
certainly there's been plenty of minimum wage decisions that have been above the all points, the all groups inflation area. That's certainly the case. Okay. What we would argue is that basically that's not enough.
No, I misunderstood your submission, and now I understand it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Diamond.
Thank you.
Mr. Toomey.
Thank you very much, Commissioners. This is my first time appearing before the Commission. I've brought along some additional material responding to some criticisms and gaps and a minor correction in our initial submission that I can hand over. I'm the Leader of Research and Policy Development at the WA Council of Social Service, so I'm appearing on their behalf. I'm also a Research Fellow with Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, but I'm not representing them in any way.
Can you tell us your position at Waycosta Council? Leader of Research and Policy?
Research and Policy Development. So it has changed recently. So there is a card attached.
All right.
So I'd also like to start briefly by acknowledging country. Kaya Nalakare Swajak Nongamor, Kayan Karak Nichibucha. The West Australian Council of Social Service considers the minimum wage to be a vital means of protecting low-income workers from poverty, as well as contributing to the delivery of economic benefits to the wider Australian community. We've supported the call from Unions WA for a real wage increase. So we've said that we believe that an increase in the state minimum wage of $45 a week up to C10 level and 5.7% beyond that would be consistent with the need to maintain a fair system of wages and conditions. I'm not going to go through all of the details that I've given to you there. I did want to highlight a couple of things that, as I go through. The reason why...
Perhaps I can reassure you,
Yes.
Mr Toomey, that we will read your documents with interest, so certainly we would appreciate you drawing particular attention to anything that you think we need to.
Thank you very much. I've included there as well some data that's just been released today. I've been promised some more OECD data, but that's probably not going to arrive until overnight. So I will, if I receive that tomorrow, supply that to you if that's of help. In terms of why we've called for a real wage increase, we've focused particularly on issues around the changing nature of work. So the growth of underemployment, precarious work, issues around the gender pay gap and cost of living pressures for people on lower incomes, how that links to issues of financial resilience, issues as well about what we've seen from the impacts of austerity, particularly in the European Union, and how that's acted as a drag on growth. We're also particularly concerned about issues around affordable housing and rental affordability, and we've included some reference to some very good data that was released this morning by Vahuri and Professor Rachel Long from Curtin University. The other thing that we've also I wanted to draw attention to was our international commitments under the Sustainable Development Goals. And that goes towards that issue that was being raised about the signalling problem and the issue of the kind of push up from lifts in the minimum wage. And so I'll come back to that issue in a minute. The thing I did wish to correct in our initial submission was Figure 1. I've supplied you with a new version of that. We had incorrectly given you the wrong data. We meant to give you the unemployment rate rather than the underutilisation rate. What you will see from the data we've provided is that while the quantum is different, the overall trend is the same. The data we've given you is actually the data that was released this morning, so you will see that there is an additional kick up in the tail there, that in the last set of figures we've seen a drop in unemployment and an increase in underemployment. And so that's the latest ABS data. We're particularly concerned about the rise of insecure work, unpredictable work hours and underemployment. And we contend that the Commission should give increased consideration to the capacity of the minimum wage to provide adequate support to the significant rising number of workers on the minimum wage who are bouncing in and out of precarious employment, particularly because of a lot of the transactional costs moving in and out of jobs, in and out of income support, and the risks that that has around their financial resilience. I wanted to respond to the comments made by the Chamber of Commerce and Industry in their commentary on our submission at point 4.5, where they had said the recent growth in part-time jobs and decline in number of full-time positions in WA is largely a result of changing economic circumstances facing the state and not necessarily indicative of a longer-term trend. So one of the things I've supplied for you there is the ABS Spotlight on Underemployment, which in fact gives you the trend data from 1980 to 2016, which shows quite dramatically a drop in the unemployment rate and an increase in the underemployment rate. So it establishes nationally that that's a very strong and ongoing trend. The other thing that I've also given you there is an OECD report from 2012, and I've been chasing the latest data from them. But in 2012, they were so concerned about the rising rate of underemployment in Australia in comparison to the OECD that they made it the main focus of their report in that year. So I'd like you to consider that as well. So the ABS have said in recent years Australia's unemployment rate has been trending downward while the underemployment rate has been trending upward. They've highlighted that since February 2015 there's been an increasing divergence between the rates. They've highlighted that this is particularly groups that are overrepresented are women, those aged 15 to 24 years, and that the prevalence of underemployment has consistently been the greatest in lower skilled occupation groups, and so that's particularly those on the minimum wage. So while it is certainly true that we've seen some fluctuations in the local trends that have been a response to the boom and bust cycle that we've been through with resources, we feel that that's just been more or less a correction that sits on top of that underlying trend. The other issue related that we also wanted to challenge was the implication from the Chamber of Commerce and Industry at point 4.6 that employee preference is a significant factor in the rise of part-time work and underemployment. It's very clear from the data, underemployment is a direct measure of the preference that workers have that hasn't been met. So it does not include those who want to work shorter hours. It is a measure of those who say they would like more work and they can't get it. It's also been very clear from this work that a lot of the change in the nature of the employment has been in one direction, with the choice and flexibility has benefited very much employers over employees. The extent to which that has actually freed up industry to create more employment opportunities remains to be proven. So I've also supplied you there, you'll see figure A3, and what I've given you was that data from the OECD. Basically, what that shows that comparing Australia to the OECD weighted average, our overall underutilisation rates are more or less comparable, with Australia doing slightly better than the OECD weighted average. However, you see a much greater proportion of our underutilisation is made up of underemployment, and that this proportion increased significantly during that period. So it shows both, there's evidence there both of an underlying international trend, but it also shows that our domestic policy has exacerbated those rates of underemployment. So I think they're both things that need to be considered there. To sum up, there's a strong ongoing international trend, stronger in Australia as a result of our domestic workforce policy, and hence it's something we need to consider and to take into account, ensuring a fair system of wages and conditions are capable of meeting the living standards prevailing in our communities for workers who are reliant on the minimum wage and are increasingly facing precarious employment. I also wanted to point out that the data that we'd provided around income inequality, that's the Gini coefficient, is in fact the most available up-to-date data in Australia. It relies on the ABS household survey data information, and there hasn't been any more of that produced since the figures that we gave. So while it's not this year's data, it is definitely the most up-to-date data that there is. And what it shows in particular is that Western Australia has the highest rate of income inequality in Australia. And this also then relates to the issues that we were talking about the kind of relative impact of increases in income for those on lower incomes in terms of boosting demand for goods and services. One thing I'd also like to draw your attention to in relation to that, on page 8 of our original submission, we make reference to the findings of the UK Low Pay Commission, and I'd suggest that's a body that it's worth looking at the work that they do. They've actually done some analysis over the last 15 years that demonstrates that increases in the minimum wage in the UK have had no significant effect on employment or hours at an aggregate level. So it's actually refuting that claim that by pushing up the minimum wage that you're going to see more people losing employment, which I think goes substantially to some of the arguments that were being made beforehand.
But what has been the quantum of some of those increases? I mean,
I'm happy to take that on notice. I can't recall the figures off the top of my head.
And obviously they wouldn't affect employment if they were miserly.
Yes, well, look, I'll get back to you on that. Yes, I'm sorry about that.
I don't think there's been any real argument that what you say in general terms is correct, subject to the comment that's been made, I think, by Professor Barrett or in the Plowman report much earlier, to the effect that it depends upon the quantum of the increase as to when and if any negative effect might kick in.
Okay, I'm quite happy to take that on notice.
Thank you.
And get back to you about that. One thing that I did mention earlier was that issue around both that kind of signalling effect and what's the impact of rises on minimum wage on wages across the economy. It has actually been an issue that's been of increasing international focus, and in fact Australia, in our commitments to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, has given a commitment that we would be raising the wages of the lowest 40% of workers faster than those of the general community. How we're actually going to do that hasn't been specified so far, but I would argue that you would need to be increasing the minimum wage in a way that didn't necessarily signal up or push on to be able to do that. I just don't know how you do that practically.
You answered the question I was going to ask, which is I just don't know how it's to be done.
Yeah.
When we know from what we hear from the parties that the employees of the businesses that Mr Moss represents will say if an unskilled worker gets, say, 3%, you can't give us less than that. In fact, we should get more than that because we're more valuable. We should get the 3.5, and we know that the unions that Dr Diamond represents, if an unskilled worker gets 3%, will be entitled to say we have skilled workers who should get more than that. So my question was going to be, do you have anything to add to how we stop that kind of process and lead to a real increase for the lowly paid?
And I suppose the problem there is it's the logic behind those knock-on decisions, and that we actually need to be arguing against. No, this is a deliberate policy and a deliberate move that's about closing those gaps in income equality. It's not that thing that I'm disproportionate to someone, so therefore I deserve more. And the problem is, I guess, if we continue the way we're going, we're not successfully addressing the issue.
And I think someone last year made the point that the people who want to use the percentage increase in the minimum wage aren't going to be reading the fine detail of any decision which is saying we're trying to quarantine this for the lowly paid. They're just going to go to the headline and make whatever use of that they think is in their best interest.
So I suppose that comes back onto us as advocates and people who are making these decisions to make sure that we're communicating quite publicly what is the logic behind that, what are our aspirations in terms of trying to close those income gaps, because otherwise, as you say, we're getting caught in a bit of a vicious circle.
Thanks, Mr Tim.
I did also want to clarify the argument we presented in our submission in terms of gender wage inequality and why that matters around the settings of the minimum wage. We do state quite clearly in our submission that women workers are more likely to be dependent on the minimum wage, they're more likely to be underemployed, and again that's about their preference to be working more hours rather than decisions to do that have something to do, for instance, with caring responsibilities or rates of unpaid work, which don't have any connection to that. So, and these issues are particularly important to us because community services sector, our employees, 75 to 80% of them are women, and we've been involved at both the state and national level, in our advocacy around equal remuneration orders and so on.
I found it very interesting, Mr Toomey, just by the way, that in figure 27 that there is reference there to productive or paid work, with the suggestion that unpaid work is not productive, but nonetheless I'll just note that in passing.
I'm just going to look to that. That would not be...
would not be something you would say, Mr Toomey.
No, it's certainly not something we would say. That's something that we've copied from elsewhere. And I suppose part of my making those comments was I wanted to actually clarify. that on the one hand, while we talk about the level of unpaid work as well being done, that certainly has an impact on kind of the living standards and the impacts on the quality of life of women, but it is not something that is a reason around why there should be any disparity in wages and conditions. And so in particular, I've highlighted the recent GWEA and Bankwest Curtin report around gender inequality insights, and so that highlights that WA has by far the highest gender pay gap of any state at 23.9%, ahead of the national average of 16%. And I do acknowledge, as was discussed earlier, that the gender pay gap for those on award wages is 13.1% compared to 19.1% for those on individual agreements. But that in fact highlights the importance of those award wage conditions for actually closing that gap. And the fact that the gap is so high in Western Australia, part of that goes to what is the makeup of employment, which different industries are prevailing here. But I suppose I would say that it's very important that we're actually considering, given that more women are on the minimum wage, that we are actually doing what we can to help close the pay gap for them. I also wanted to offer some quick comments around the issues of poverty. There was a suggestion that the Chamber of Commerce and Industry made that the 50% poverty line that we'd used was an arbitrary measure of poverty. It is in fact the international standard. It's the standard that's adopted by the ABS, by the OECD and the European Union. Certainly there are three different types of measures of poverty that you have. There are those ones around that make reference to median disposable incomes. There are those that are measures of relative deprivation, where they look at what things people can or can't access or afford to buy. And then there are those that are subjective, where they're actually asking people on surveys how poor they feel or think they are. And while all of those have an important role to play in understanding and studying poverty, it has been that 50% poverty line and that relative to median wages one has been the one that's been seen to be the most robust and reliable. And one of the problems that we struggle with is that there is very, very little data on those relative deprivation measures. Certainly the Australian government has recently committed, I think it was something in around about $9 million to fund the creation of a new measure around relative deprivation, but that hasn't actually come in force yet. The other thing that I would point out there is the data that we used calculating Western Australian rates was based on comparison to national medians, and that was the one that was estimating nearly 240,000 Western Australians living in poverty. That is a conservative estimate. The analysis, for instance, by the Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre presented at the forum we did last year around Poverty Week, based on the state median rate, the WA poverty rate goes from 14 to 17.6%, which suggests there's more like 300,000 people living below the poverty line here. So I've included some of those numbers and analysis in the numbers that I've given you. The other thing that I would quote coming out of that research is that it concludes, while Perth ranks only 6th across all state capitals on the standard poverty measure, rises to second place when ranked in terms of severe poverty. So that's another issue that's of concern there. I've also given you there, just for your information, the distribution of income to show where the poverty lines sit, to show that 50% of that median equivalised income isn't sitting halfway, it's definitely sitting way down into the tail there. That's that blue line on that figure. The particular reason why we've talked about poverty and insecure work goes to the issues around financial resilience and what is the impact of the changing nature on work, on the responsiveness of people on the minimum wage who are moving in and out of unemployment. And one of the structural concerns that we have is that social security levels, our income support for unemployed people, has been kept artificially at such a low level that it in fact is undermining their resilience. So we've very much got a social security system that hasn't kept up with the changing nature of work. It's built around a time when people would be in long-term work in particular industries, might have a sustained period of unemployment but would expect to move back into another position and hold that. And so for people bouncing in and out and bouncing between those systems, particularly given that we've reduced all of the things like liquid asset thresholds and so on that go to their savings and their resilience, it's getting to the point where it undermines their ability to actually be responsive to changing workforce needs. And so it's getting to the point where it's getting in the way of economic development and labour force responsiveness rather than providing an incentive. So, and I would highlight that's particularly critical for younger workers, and I've included in there some stuff that's showing gross income against net worth, which just kind of highlights that for younger people, they have very little savings, very little financial resilience. And so bouncing in and out of precarious employment, they can very much kind of struggle to be in a position to respond to opportunities, to move for work opportunities or anything like that. So I'd also, the other thing that we've talked about a bit there is the work that we've been doing around cost of living research. I wanted to highlight there that the model that we have, so we model 3 different households, one of which is a low working, a dual income household with one on a minimum wage and one on some part-time casual employment. The model focuses very much just on essential living cost. It doesn't include a whole pile of the other things that would actually go towards what you would consider community standards and expectations around things like school excursions, birthday presents, health costs, home and contents insurance, a whole pile of those things that would actually be built in. And so what we're reflecting there isn't showing that the fact that there is a gap between that level and people's income isn't saying, well, they've got a buffer and that's something that would go to savings. It's that we're simply not reflecting a lot of those day-to-day costs. And I suppose this is where I wanted to go to that issue that was discussed earlier around CPI and household fees and charges. Because, so for instance, in the Chamber of Commerce and Industry submission, they comment that our submission makes reference to increases in household fees and charges without consideration of changes in pricing with respect to other expensive, saying that caution needs to be taken in unpacking CPI, which is currently the most reliable measure for determining inflation. What we're looking at here is we're not considering inflation, we're looking at the capacity of minimum wage workers to maintain acceptable standards of living. And that headline CPI rate actually contains a whole pile of things that don't reflect the day-to-day costs of those on low incomes, including those on the minimum wage, who spend a lot more of their income on household fees and charges. They're a lot more sensitive to rises in household fees and charges, and they are things that have gone up in successive years much faster than that headline CPI rate. So I think that was the key point that I wanted to make then.
So I'd just like to understand that. You're saying that if we are to look at the needs of the low paid,
yes,
or contribute to improved living standards, we're basically, you're saying, obliged to unpack the all-group CPI to an extent.
Yes, yes. Certainly, I think the way to reflect that would be to say households on lower incomes are more, spend a greater proportion.
Proportionate, isn't it? Your
Yeah.
argument is
Yes.
the percentage of income spent on certain elements of the CPI basket
Yes.
of items
Yes,
disproportionately affects the low paid.
yes. So certainly those ones around the cost of utilities, the cost of housing, the cost of food, those essentials whereas a lot of the other CPI items, which you might consider discretionary or luxury goods, are the places that we've seen coming down more in recent years. The cost of holidays or plasma TVs or something like that. So, yeah, certainly.
Thank you.
Just some quick comments around the issues of rental affordability. I mentioned that report on housing supply responsiveness in Australia that Ahuri released today, and I've given you some links and references to that. I just wanted to highlight a couple of the conclusions that came out of that report. One of the things that Professor Rachel Ong, who's the lead author, says on that is certain capital cities' housing supply is actually outpacing population growth. However, in some capital cities like Sydney and Perth, we find that housing supply is not able to keep up with population growth rates. She then highlights that most new housing supply is concentrated in middle to high concentrated segments. We normally expect to see a trickle-down effect where building higher value homes lead to the opening up of lower value homes for those on lower incomes, but our research indicates that this is not the case. Unfortunately, what that means is for the study period between 2006 and 2014, less than 1% of new housing supply has been delivered to the lowest decile in the housing market. So what they're saying there is actually, while we've seen on a lot of these measures of rental affordability and housing supply, that overall median rates have come down, we have not seen that supply at the lower end of the market. We haven't seen the trickle-down effect that we've been told should be there. And that was also confirmed in the Anglicare rental affordability snapshot data that we pointed to, which, while it showed improvement for couples that were on the minimum wage, it highlighted that for single parents on the minimum wage and singles without children, the rental market remains clearly unaffordable, and there are little or no places that they were easily able to access. I think that highlighted that there were less than 1% of rental properties advertised that they could afford. So, and I've provided you some more detail on those, but I won't go over that. We also highlighted those issues around transport costs and utility costs as things that impact disproportionately on people on the minimum wage. I think that's most of the factors that I wanted to go to. I did want to disagree with the comments earlier that were saying that maintaining employment is sufficient for improved living standards, and I'm hoping that I've addressed those in what I was talking about through the stuff to do with underemployment. I also thought I'd offer some comments around the multiplier effect and how that relates to the state government policy around public service wage freeze, because I think one thing that's important to understand there is the difference of the multiplier effect for those on the minimum wage who are likely to spend a much higher proportion of their income versus those on public sector salaries who will actually be receiving a higher level of income. They're certainly not on those minimum wage levels. That's not saying that we're supporting that policy, but just that the way the multiplier effect works there will be different. So I think that's about it. I suppose in conclusion, I would just say that we believe that raising the state minimum wage is crucial for addressing the growth and cost of living pressures that have over recent years disproportionately impacted on low-income individuals and households in WA. We feel that there is still quite a bit of catching up that needs to be done. Certainly in our successive cost of living reports over the last decade, we've clearly shown that gap that opened out during the economic boom conditions in Western Australia hasn't closed for those on low incomes, including those on the minimum wage. So I think that's all I'd like to say, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Toomey. Now, Dr. Diamond, anything you want to reply to?
Just perhaps to make a few points about just sort of the nature of the signalling effect in terms of what happens in bargaining across the economy in other areas where people have enterprise bargains, things like that. Look, to some extent, I'm probably repeating myself a bit from last year and also from earlier today, but I'll just make the point that Unions WA, in terms of its affiliates, is in favour of, if you like, free collective bargaining, if I could put it like that. So to take an example of the state public sector, our criticism of the public sector pay policy, for example, is that it's really premised on foreclosing any free collective bargaining between the workforce and the employer. That is our principal issue with it. So in terms of the signalling of a minimum wage increase being taken up by other workers in a who are perhaps better placed to bargain for their own conditions, as I said previously, I don't think that is something that should really factor into the Commission's decisions on an increase in the minimum wage, for the simple reason that workers may make the case that they are worth a certain increase for this year or for the next few years. It is then the task of employers, if they think that's too much, to make the case that that is not possible. That's how our collective bargaining system works. The minimum wage is, of course, a minimum that cuts across the labour market, but we don't accept the premise that that the workers pay, insofar as they may look to an increase in the minimum wage, are necessarily wrong about their own worth in the labour market. If they are wrong, then really it's up to the employers to make that case that that's the issue. And that's why we don't think that bargaining outcomes in terms of collective agreements, enterprise bargaining agreements, etc., is something that necessarily we think should play into your decisions about what proportion of increase should go to the state minimum wage. We are firmly of the view that the signalling is very much at the lower end, at that award-free end, at that agreement-free end, more to the point, about what's a fair thing for people to be paid sort of across the board, or at minimum, if you like. And anything above that people may choose to collectively bargain for is about the agreement between the parties.
Thank you. Mr Moss, anything from you?
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. We will rely largely on our submissions in reply. Just with respect to the comments that WACOS has made, in particular, they've given a reasonable amount of additional information, some of which is quite new. And I've certainly not had the opportunity to look at this, so I would have asked perhaps the Commission for Court Sessions permission to perhaps provide some written responses to that material once we've had an opportunity to digest it.
And when would you be looking at doing that?
Hopefully by Monday, if that would be acceptable. In particular, it raises a couple of reports that, one being released today, others which wasn't included in the original submission. I'd preface on keeping my comments strictly limited to that new material.
Yes, all right, thank you.
Just a point of clarification, we did make a reference in response to WACOS submission about the impact or the recent growth in part-time employment and with respect to the decline in full-time employment. In no way were we seeking to it wasn't, in making that comment, we weren't saying the underemployment issue isn't a problem. We do recognise it is a problem. Rather, the rapid growth that we've had in part-time employment and at the expense of full-time employment appears to be a result of the recent changes in the economy. Also, we did say that one of the factors influencing part-time employment is preference, is their employee preference, but it's not the sole factor in influencing it. And in particular, one of the things that we have identified in our submission is our concern about the underutilisation or underemployment rate, and that there is a significant proportion, a very large proportion of employees, approximately 130,000 of which, and the actual details are in our original submission, part-time employees who want more hours, and approximately 13,000 full-time workers who are working part-time hours because of economic situations. And part of our concern is having a wage policy which allows people the opportunity to increase those hours. We will talk, in particular, one of the concerns we have with respect to unpacking CPI is in focusing on specific elements, such as utility rates and the like. There's not an alternative model being put forward. Rather, it is looking at specific components and highlighting the impact that that may or may not have on low-income earners. In the absence of, we reinforce our concerns about the unpacking of CPI, a concern that we do know the Commission Court session has raised previously. In the absence of any properly considered alternative model that would allow us to explore what the impact of these costs might be on the low pay, taking all things into consideration, rather than simply focusing on things that...
I recognise the concern that you raised, Mr Moss, bearing in mind, though, that the CPI is one of the factors that we consider. And whilst there's been a view that the CPI as a measure shouldn't be unpacked, there may be other elements that are taken into account in considering the requirements that we're required to look into in making our decisions. So I don't, for myself, whilst there's been a reluctance to unpack the CPI, and we could, I think, spend weeks hearing people's various arguments about the particular components of the CPI and how they relate, it is but one measure that we utilise in looking at a whole range of factors.
Yeah, thank you, Chief Commissioner, and I certainly do recognise that. But yeah, the concern we have is, it is for the time being one of the more reliable measures that we have available to us. We have made a number of comments with respect to the modelling that Unions WA has made with respect to the flow-on impact they portray that an increase in wages will have on the greater economy. We do very much pick up and reinforce the concerns that we've raised with respect to that, and I won't take any further on that. On that particular aspect. One of the things that hasn't been addressed is the concept of increasing minimum wage for low-paid earners and what impact does that have on the attractiveness of them versus skilled workers as well. We are also very much concerned with the comment with respect to wage increases have no effect on employment. Concerns have been raised before that in particular significant or high increases may well have an impact on employment opportunities, and would like to reinforce that particular message that seems to be picked up as well. Otherwise, I'll refer to our previous submissions and replies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Moss. Mr Entrican, anything in reply?
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. I'll just keep it brief. There's just a couple of points. Firstly, we just thought it might be useful for the other parties just to clarify that most of the data produced by Treasury, particularly in today's presentation, is in annual averages. It's important to clarify that annual averages is a longer-term trend data. So if you have 4 quarters, if data is released quarterly, it's an average of the 4 quarters divided by an average of the previous 4 quarters, or if it's monthly, an average of the 12 months divided by the previous 12 months. The reason that's important is you can actually have the situation where in annual average terms employment can be falling, but in year 2 terms, employment can actually be increasing. So one is looking at the longer term trend, and it takes a while to turn that trend around. That effectively ties in with my second point, was just to pick up that today there was some labour force material released, which is quite positive. What it does highlight, though, was that although employment in annual average terms is still expected to be negative in 2016-17, over the last 12 months, total employment has increased in raw numbers, and it has increased, full-time employment has increased in raw numbers as well. And I note that certainly the trend unemployment rate has been going down. It's reduced further to 6.1% today. There was an enormous drop in the seasonally adjusted unemployment rate from 6.5% to 5.9%. But that can be a lot more volatile, that seasonally adjusted data. So that was something that was worth noting, that full-time employment and total employment have increased for the last 7 consecutive months, which is something positive. I'll just touch on a point the CCI raised about some of the rates in the state system being lower than in the federal system. We are happy to provide some examples of that if the Commission so chooses. We haven't listed all of those rates in our submission and reply, but in terms of apprentices and trainees, for trainees, in most of the 122 modern awards at the back, there's an attached schedule with the trainee rates. That is also the statutory minimum rate for trainees in the national system. If you look at that and you look at the trainee rates in the state wage order and you put them together, you'll clearly see that they are higher in the national system by a long ways in every classification. And you can run the same comparison with apprentice rates, because there was a significant increase in apprentice rates in the national system in 2013, which hasn't been the case in Western Australia. So all we say is we're not making it up. There is those statistics. We're happy to produce them if people want us to. We simply made that point. In terms of focusing on the people who are unable to bargain, I'm not sure if the CTO was arguing that we would pay more attention to those who already have an agreement, but certainly we are aware that the criterion 50A is about the needs of those who are unable to bargain, which is actually the reverse of what it is in some of the Fair Work criteria actually talk about the need to encourage bargaining. In Western Australia it's reversed. It's effectively focusing on the needs of those that are unable to bargain. But there is also an overall objective of the Industrial Relations Act to encourage bargaining. Probably one point I would make is that whether or not people bargain or don't bargain in Western Australia for industrial agreements is almost entirely based on whether they have a union presence and a history of bargaining.
There's also, I think, the structural issue of those who are covered by the minimum wage tend to be those in small businesses, which tend not to be organised, and in those cases they are limited in their capacity to bargain, certainly within the formal structures.
Certainly, Chief Commissioner, that's exactly right. So if they don't have a union presence as such, then they tend not to bargain. That's correct. I'll just reiterate, just in relation to the apprenticeship and traineeship rates, that the Minister isn't suggesting that there should be a substantial or enormous increase to minimum rates for apprentices and trainees to make them more competitive or attractive, if you like. The Minister is only proposing that the $19.20 a week increase be flowed on proportionally to trainees and apprentices, so we're not proposing that there be any abnormal change to the model. that's in place at the moment. So, yeah, with that in mind, we rest on our submissions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Entrican. Thank you all for your submissions. There have been a number of things that have arisen today that would require further information to be provided to us. The first is that a number of you have commented on the employment data that was released by the ABS today, and I imagine that whilst you've had perhaps an opportunity to have a cursory look at that, I wonder if you would like to make any additional comments about that in writing to us within the next few days, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But also, Mr. Entrican, you've raised most recently the issue of the training rates in the national system and in the WA system. If you'd be so kind as to provide that information, that would be helpful. I think you were also going to provide some further information on, was it youth? Regional employment. Yes, if you would do so. Mr. Moss wants to respond to the information today provided by WACOS, and I think there was something that Dr. Diamond, were you going to provide us with something additional, or am I just being...
I wasn't going to provide something additional, but I believe there was a discussion from one of the commissioners about relative increases in the minimum wage in the UK.
There was that low pay commission, I think it was called, wasn't it, Mr. Toomey? You were going to let us know what they had actually awarded by way of minimum wage increases over the last 15 years of the study.
All right, thank you for that. I wonder if it might... I was contemplating that you might be able to do those things by the close of business tomorrow. Mr. Moss has asked for Monday to respond to WACOS, so perhaps in the scheme of things, if you could provide all of that material to us by the close of business Monday, that would be very helpful to us. Right. Thank you again for your submissions and for the evidence that's been presented. We'll reconvene again when the national minimum wage decision is handed down within a couple of days of that. Thank you. We'll adjourn.